In this episode of Paint Society, I'm going to show you how to take this primer finish and sand it down properly with a few easy steps and get it ready for paint. And thanks for joining me on this episode. My name is Brian, and today we're going to talk a little bit about the key preparations of which sandpapers do you need. With all the different sandpaper grits on the market, it can be very, very confusing. But in this episode, we're going to clear it all up so you can have beautiful spray paint jobs, whether it's in your home garage or at your professional environment. Now, you might remember when we sprayed primer on this C5 fender right here in our backyard, and it came out a little bit rough at first, and then we smoothed it out. But the surface feels overall pretty good. But where do we start when we start the key preparation in primer? We need to first knock it flat. And to knock it flat, you're gonna need to use a block. And there's a few different blocks you can use. But today we're using Eastwood's vacuum system. It's gonna keep my garage a lot cleaner, and it's got the vacuum holes that will hook up right to a regular vacuum cleaner. So we're gonna use a smaller block because we're gonna have a lot more control over what we want to sand. And what you're gonna wanna get started first with your primer project to get it sanded down is you're gonna wanna start flattening out with a 320 grit. Now let's say that you're not sure about the body work and you wanna reprime it. Well, in that case, you can take your 180 grit and then you can cut it completely down, and then from there you can refine it up to 320 and reprime it. But we're getting ready for paint, and we don't wanna put an aggressive sand scratch in our finish that we can't recover from, and we still want to have primer on our project before it comes down to painting. Now, before you start any primer project, you're going to need some guide coat. Now, guide coat is going to go into any of the small ridges or crevices, and it's going to get to the deepest part of the primer, and it's going to show you where you still need to sand. Now, if you're going to use black spray paint, be prepared because it dries a little bit slower and it will clog your sandpaper. That's why we prefer to use the guide coat, spend a few extra bucks to get the right product for the job. And when you apply this, we're not painting it, we're literally just misting it on. There's no reason for you to get heavy with this stuff. All you need is just a little bit to change the color, and that will do the job just fine. And in an effort to keep my shop much cleaner at home, I have my shop back here, and we have the Eastwood vacuum system. Now all we gotta do is take that other end of the hose and we plug it right into here, and we are ready to extract dust right from the block, which is a nice nifty tool because I don't want any dust in this area because this is gonna be my painting area as well. Now I want to show you, we just did a small quick pass, and with the 320, it's already flattened out nice and smooth. Now, do you see any of these little black areas here, the little deep areas or the unsanded areas? This is why guide coat is so important, because the guide coat will show you the scratches. The guide coat is effectively going to tell you, hey, look here, I haven't been sanded, sand me some over here. And what the guide coat is going to do is really show you, do you have this completely sanded? Because sometimes we can just do this without the guide coat. We might think we're good, but the guide coat is a true indicator of how far you do need to sand. So let's sand a little bit more and see if we need any more refinement in this area. And with that quick pass, we learned a couple things. We learned that this area, for the most part, is pretty good. But then we also learned that we have some low spots here. Generally, if you see a low spot like this, see how there's still just a little bit of guide coat? You gotta pay attention to this stuff, because if you don't, when you go to paint, it's gonna look like a little bit of a low spot. Now, there's two things that you can do with this. The first thing is we can try to see if it sands out. The reason why I think it's low is because of the shape of the fender. It starts to come up at the edge here, and it's revealing what would seem to be a low spot, but is it really? Okay, so what you want to do first is we're going to try to see if it sands out. If it doesn't sand out, then it's going to need a little bit of glaze filler. And to see if it sands out, we're not going to come all the way to the edge. We're just going to stop right there before the edge, and we're going to see if it in fact is just because of the shape of the fender. These are things you need to pay attention to. You can see without the dust extraction, because I want you guys to hear me, look at the difference here. Without that dust extraction, there is dust completely everywhere. There's a big, big difference. Let me go ahead and turn it on and suck it up. And we can see now that the dust is all gone, that guide coat has disappeared. It was in fact because of the shape of the actual fender that was giving us a false illusion as to a low spot. So those are things you just gotta pay attention to. Now we're gonna carry on to the larger part of the fender, and now we're gonna keep our sanding strokes much longer. We don't want short sanding strokes because that can create low spots. So try to take it and extend it about a good 12 to 18 inches to get it nice and flat. Now, once you have it all sanded, what you're gonna wanna do is use a pre-painting prep. And this spray basically is like a wax and grease remover, and it's gonna get all the dust and contaminants out of the sand scratches so that we can go ahead and move on to the next step. This is a very important stage in the painting process, so always make sure that you have your panels nice and clean. You might notice some breakthroughs. We're gonna talk about how to address those in just a moment. Now, to cover up those burn throughs, if you're at home and you're just working on your own little project, this will probably be the best way for you to do it. Now, at the shop or a more professional environment, we would use a sealer on the primer, and a sealer is an unsanded primer. It's a thinned out primer. But for you guys at home, the perfect match, it's gonna work just fine. And the reason why it works well is because it's a very thin primer, and you're gonna wanna put this on before the final sanding stage. Now for this, you only want one light coat on all those burn throughs, and this kind of creates a bridge between any of those burn through areas and your primer. That way, when you go to paint, you're not gonna have any wrinkling or anything like that of that nature. Now, one thing you do need to remember is if you are using this Perfect Match Duplicolor or any aerosol spray can to completely primer your project, you cannot 320 grit it initially. You need to use a much higher grit. This project, we're using a 2K urethane surfacer primer. It is meant to take the beating of the 320 grit scratch because it has body to it. All right, so we can still 320 grit it, and then we can 400, 600, or whatever we need to do with it. You've seen this on the channel. This is for budget spray can jobs, okay? This is for small little things you wanna do. This is not for big types of spray jobs. We're using this only as a little budget friendly cost to bridge over those little burn throughs, because to professionally and correctly do it, we would be using a 2K urethane sealer, which is a thinned out primer that doesn't get sanded. But I want to offer an option to the guys in the garage that might not want to seal and still make sure that we don't have any issues with those burn throughs, because sometimes when you've got that paint, it can go ahead and the solvents in the paint can open up the differences of surfaces between primer and old paint. So by using a little bit of this 1K aerosol, it's gonna help you out a little bit on those burn throughs. But again, my biggest recommendation obviously is to seal it before primer. And we're gonna wanna follow up with that guide coat once more, because now the guide coat is going to sit within the 320 grit scratches, and we wanna thoroughly remove those, and we're gonna be using a P600 on an interface pad and sander to do so. And we'll be using that interface pad and that P600 because what it's going to do is going to soften up the scratch. That interface pad that you're seeing right here, well, that is a cushion and it gives a nice soft sand scratch. Now, an alternative to this is to water sand or wet sand your primer for the final stage. Water sanding and wet sanding for me is just a little bit too messy, and I can't see what I'm doing as I can with the actual sander. Now, keep in mind also the cushion of the sander is going to give a softer sand scratch. So a P600 on an interface with a DA sander is going to leave a softer scratch than it would if you were to have a P600 by hand. Now, you don't need a fancy sander. I've actually done a video comparing different sanders, and I felt that the $40 Black & Decker sander with the interface pad was one of the best sanders that you could get on the market for the price to do the job. I would also recommend a sander that has variable speed so you can control the type of speed and cutting power that you're putting into the actual fender itself. Now, it is nice to be able to have the vacuum sander and keep dust completely contained within the dust extractor, but not everyone is going to want to do that. There's only really one thing that matters here, and that's removing the P320 grit scratches, and that's just what we're doing. I would say that a P600 is at the max for what you want to use in order to remove those P320. You can also use a P500, but you'll find out here that the P600 really did a great job of removing those P320 grit scratches. That's a little bit of a big jump, but you're not going to want to go further than that and have a nice surface for painting within that P600. You could put paint right over that without sealing. You might have noticed when we were blocking and sanding, we couldn't get into some of these grooves. You're going to want to get yourself some maroon scuff pads or gray. Maroon is equivalent to 400 and the gray is equivalent to around 600 to 800. The difference is your finishing. So for solid colors, you can finish between 400 and 600, but for your metallics, if you're not going to seal, you're going to want to finish between 600 and 800. I'm always going to recommend sealing, but again, I do know you guys in the garage is an extra step, and sometimes sealer can introduce more dirt into the paint, and I totally get that. I really hope this video helped you out with your primer stage, and hopefully your project is that much closer to getting into the spray booth or into your garage to paint. But until then, guys, this is Brian from Paint Society reminding you, don't overthink it. It's just paint. I'll see you guys on the next episode.